this is Misty, and right now I'm going to start a discussion on the Cold War. Just be warned, this is a really big topic, and I'm going to go through really, really quickly because it's something that we talk about in great detail in Global 10. So I'm going to fly through this pretty fast. Um, First off, the number one thing you have to know about the Cold War is this period of animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it starts after World War II. You may remember in World War II, the Soviet Union and Stalin, Joseph Stalin was on our side. He was one of the allies. He helped us defeat Hitler. But what ends up happening is after the war, that relationship falls apart. Remember, the communist system is completely different from the America system, right? Economically and politically. So, as a political system, communism is a totalitarian government, right? So that means it has total control over society, over the people. There's no freedom. Versus the United States, we are a democracy, right? The people have a voice in government. We're a republic, so that means people vote for their representatives. And so that's a conflict. But also, its economy is completely different. The Soviet Union is a totalitarian government, and that total control extends to its economy. So, in the Soviet Union, it's different than America. Prices are not set by supply and demand. The government sets the prices. Government tells you what you're going to charge for a certain good. The government owns all the businesses, right? In America, businesses are owned by people. People can own one. Not in a communist country. In the Soviet Union, the government owned all the businesses. The government set prices, and as opposed to in America where supply and demand, where we have a free market, there is no freedom in the Soviet Union. So again, it's a huge conflict. And what makes the bad situation worse is the Soviet Union spreads its influence into Eastern Europe. What happens is after World War II, the Soviet Union had occupied these countries of Eastern Europe and refuses to give them up. It says we need a buffer zone, and it installs communist governments in these countries. And what happens is the United States is terrified that that the Soviet Union is going to spread its influence and continue to spread its influence beyond Eastern Europe, right? That's like with the political cartoon, the grabby octopus, that it's going to spread further. And if you look at the map, the fear is that it could spread south into Greece and Turkey, and then of course west into not just Eastern Europe, but to continue to spread into Western Europe. So the United States does not want to have World War III. We're not going to be able to wipe the Soviet Union off the map. Instead, our goal is just to contain the Soviet Union. We want to contain the spread of communism. So fine, communism has reached these areas, okay, but we do not want it to spread any further. We need to contain it. Stop the spread of communism. And how do you do it? What's the best weapon to do it? Well, the best weapon is generally money. And why do I say that? If you think about communism, right, a communist economy is kind of based on this idea that wealth should be taken from the rich and should be distributed to everyone, that it should be a little bit more fair, right? That there shouldn't be any business owners. Remember that if in a communist country, one of the first things they do is land reform, where they take land away from the wealthy and they spread it to all the peasants. So you can understand a system like that generally is not going to appeal to rich people, because if you get communism, they're going to lose everything. But poor people are like, hey, sounds good. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's some poor people who hate communism, and there are some rich people who love communism. But generally speaking, this is a policy, this idea of distributing wealth to the poor is going to obviously be a little bit more popular with poor people. So one of the ways you're going to stop the spread of communism is don't let people be that poor, right? Because a lot of these countries, Turkey and Greece and Western Europe, their economies have been trashed from World War II, right? The wars had destroyed their property and things like that. So there was this fear that because of the economic collapse in these countries, that their economies are doing so bad, if their economies collapse, they could switch to communism. So the U.S. wants to prevent that, and the way we prevent it is by giving these countries lots and lots of money. So the first one is the Truman Doctrine. That's where we give a lot of financial aid to Greece and Turkey. And later we follow that up with the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is where we give billions of dollars to Western Europe, again, to stabilize their economy. And by stabilizing their economy, help them stabilize their government and stop the spread of communism. All right. Another big part of the Cold War is the arms race. You may remember that the first nuclear bomb is developed in the Manhattan Project by the United States. And we drop an atom bomb on Hiroshima, on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And as you look at this graphic, you see where it has the little A bomb, that little one. So that's the destructive power of those bombs. But like any technology, right? Scientists, once they make something, they usually aren't like, okay, we're done. You know, that's usually not it. They go back and they try to improve it and make it better and make it better and make it better, which can be great if they're doing, cell phones. But, when they're doing it to weapons, it's a kind of sad situation, but that's the reality. So they start making weapons that are even more powerful and more powerful and more improvements and more improvements. And so what you see is during the Cold War is they develop a new type of bomb known as a hydrogen bomb. And hydrogen bombs have much more destructive power. So for example, an atom bomb was enough to take out these small towns. An H bomb? You take out the tri-state area. I mean, you take out a state. It's crazy. Really, really powerful weapons. Now, because of this, U.S. foreign policy changes, and we develop a policy known as Brinksmanship. So Brinksmanship is the idea that, as soon as you find out that another country is going to attack you, you instantly retaliate. You don't wait. You don't call somebody up. You don't, discuss or debate. You hit me, I hit you back instantly. And why? Well, because these bombs are so powerful and so destructive, you don't want to give this guy, the other side, a chance to get that hit in. The idea is like, listen, if you're going to wipe us out with nuclear bombs, just know we're going to take you down with us. And that's the idea. And that's the idea of what you see here, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea that no one wins a nuclear war. Literally during the Cold War, we have enough bombs. Actually, this is still true today. We have enough bombs to destroy the earth. And I don't mean that theoretically I mean like literally we could have a nuclear winter and kill everybody on the planet. Man, woman, child, animal, plant, what have you. We could destroy the earth. Many times over, supposedly. That's how many bombs we have. And so that's the idea, is that, look, if you start a nuclear war, you'll never survive it to enjoy the victory. We're going to kill you too. So that's what stops. A lot of people argue that's why we never had a World War III, because of this fear of mutually assured destruction. All right, so in the context of all this, so we have a lot of fear and concern about the spread of the influence of the Soviet Union. And then lo and behold, in 1949, China becomes communist too. So now we have two communist parties. Soviet Union is the first, and now China has turned communist. And this is going to lead to the second Red Scare. You may remember in the 1920s, we talked about the first Red Scare, right? And that was the one that followed the Russian Revolution, right? When Lenin changed the government of Russia, where he overthrew the government and then installed, that was with the whole Bolshevik Revolution, and the Soviet Union becomes the first communist country in the world. And there was a big fear that what happened in Russia may come to America. The second Red Scare comes in the 1950s, and that's in the context of this Cold War. There's this great fear of the spread of communism into Eastern Europe, this fear of, the spread of communism into China, this fear of, nuclear bombs being dropped on America, a lot of fear about the power of the Soviet Union. So this, in the 1950s, the House of Representatives, you may remember, right? The three branches of government, the legislative branch of government is made up of the Senate and the House. Well, the House forms the House Un-American Activities Committee, and that committee is led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. And the committee is focused on making America safe from the spread of communism. There's a huge fear that there are communists in the country. They're looking to destroy America. We need to find them. They're a threat to our nation. They need to be identified and fixed. And again, this is another example, and we've seen this over and over again, big theme in U.S. history, right? This idea that, do you want more security or more freedom? So during the 1950s, this kind of fear of communism is going to lead to, a loss of civil liberties because people are so afraid, because they want more safety from communism. Now, just to be clear, this Red Scare doesn't come out of nowhere. Okay. What's the expression? You're not paranoid if they really are out to get you, right? So people would say, oh, you're paranoid. The communists aren't really coming out to get you. But then in 1950, you have the trial of Algiers Hiss. He is a member of the U.S. State Department, and he is convicted of selling secrets to the communists, to the Soviet Union. There's something called the Pumpkin Papers, I think it's called, where he's like hiding secret documents in his pumpkin patch or whatever. Anyway, at the time he's convicted, some people argued, oh, there's not a lot of evidence. These are trumped up charges. It's not. Anyway, long story short, don't feel bad for him because basically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we got access to KGB files. And long story short, he really did it. It looks like there's a lot of evidence that he was a spy. So this is a member of our own government selling us out to the communists. And then a year later, you have the Rosenberg Trial, right? And this is the husband and wife team. And the husband was a member of the Communist Party. His brother-in-law worked for Los Alamos, where they were developing nuclear technologies and nuclear bombs. And here we have another case where they are accused of spying for the Soviet Union. And again, at the time the trial came out, people were like, oh, you're making this up and these are trumped up charges and these people are innocent. You're just coming after him because he's a member of the Communist Party. Again, evidence of since today we have enough evidence. He definitely, just again, don't feel bad. The husband was definitely spying. He definitely was doing something. He was definitely helping the Soviet Union. Was it to the point that he deserved to be executed? Because he's going to get killed for this. He's going to be executed. Maybe you could debate that one, but still, he's legit a spy. He's legit working for the downfall of the country. The wife that case is a little weaker because it's not clear how involved she was. She may have just, had bad luck marrying the wrong guy or, they don't know how actively she was involved, but she gets executed also. But like I said, like there was legitimately something going on. If you want to feel bad for anything, you feel bad for their two sons. They had two sons who ended up becoming orphans once their parents were executed for being spies. But anyway, the key thing is, as you can imagine, as an American, you have this fear of the Soviet Union spreading into Eastern Europe, this fear of nuclear bombs going off, right? I mean, people were literally building bomb shelters in their backyards because they were so feared the coming of World War III and a nuclear bomb landing on their head. And, remember, we have now a communist China. And now you see all these spies in our own government selling out our secrets. People are terrified. So this is where you start to see the rise of McCarthyism. And again, these House Un-American Activities Committee, at first it's like a legit kind of thing where, like I said, there have been people who are spying and you want to kind of figure them out. But it devolves into this thing where they just have to accuse you of being a communist sympathizer and then you're destroyed. Like literally just rumors, no evidence. They destroyed people's lives, destroyed people's careers. They did a real serious number on Hollywood. They came at like just doing anything or having any kind of contact or anything kind of civil liberties, whatever. They twisted everything into you're a communist sympathizer. Like they didn't need any evidence. They destroyed people's lives. They would blacklist you and destroy your career. Then they would accuse one person of being a communist and say, listen, I can get you out of trouble. Just give us the names of another communist. Like just give us somebody's name. Give us somebody's name. And the idea was as people were under pressure to just give up a name of anybody to get themselves out of trouble. Well, I'm not a communist, but I heard that so-and-so is a communist, and that's how you prove your loyalty. So it just gets terrible. I mean, this is a real black mark in the history of the country. And the guy who led this is Senator Joseph McCarthy. And he gets like out of his mind. Those of you who've taken global history, you may remember with Robespierre, right? If you remember, Robespierre was like, oh, there were enemies to the revolution in the French government, right? And remember, at first, that works. But then he gets to the point where he's like, and there's enemies right here in our own government, in the National Convention. It's filled with, people who are against the revolution. And I'm going to give you those names tomorrow. And you remember what happened to Robespierre, right? They ended up accusing him and then calling him an enemy of the revolution. They cut his head off. So, where he just, because he went to crazy town, he just took it too far. In a sense, it's very similar kind of situation here. Joseph McCarthy just takes it too far. He starts accusing the U.S. Army of being filled with communists. Not only is the government filled with communists, because like I said, you had Algier Hiss and members of the State Department, that he was a member of the State Department, that he was a spy. But now he starts saying the army is filled with communists. I mean, here's, he's got a map with all these Communist Party organizations and the whole country is riddled with them and we got to find them and destroy them. He goes to crazy town. And you see the guy with his head, holding his head. He's the guy sitting at the table. This guy is the lawyer for the army. And he's hearing Joseph McCarthy. And at this point, he's like practically, like he's unhinged. And he's like, this guy's out of his mind. Like he has to defend the army. And he's just twisting anything you do into evidence of being a communist sympathizer. And it just gets very extreme. So I'm going to show you this scene. What happens is there's a trial that's broadcast on television of Joseph McCarthy coming after the army. And this is broadcast on TV. And this is the beginning of the end for Joseph McCarthy.
As early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. And Mr. Cole nods his head at me. I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cole.
No, sir.
I meant to do you no personal injury. And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
See, like I said, like this kid, he was like this young guy who worked in the lawyer's office, and he had been part of the Lawyers Guild, which is not a communist party. But according to Joseph McCarthy, this was evidence that he was a communist sympathizer, and he did it. And that's why the lawyer's like, do you have no sense of decency? Like, you're attacking this poor innocent kid? Like, you're out of your mind. And this is the beginning of the end. Because people before this really had been afraid to turn against Senator McCarthy. Because if you said Senator McCarthy was wrong or evil or he was doing a bad thing, people said, oh, you're only attacking Senator McCarthy because you're a communist sympathizer. Like, literally, you couldn't win. If you tried to attack this guy, it was like, oh, you're only attacking me because you're a communist and let me da-da-da. And people were terrified of him. People were terrified of being labeled a communist because it would destroy your life. But like I said, once this gets broadcast, and like I said, he just was taking it to such an extreme, it's the beginning of the end for Senator Joseph McCarthy. He is actually censored by the Senate for his attacks. I think he dies a couple of years later from like alcohol poisoning or something. But anyway, I don't know, Google that. I can't remember what exactly it is, but I know he dies very soon after. But like I said, once these hearings are broadcast on national television, it's kind of wiped out. But it is a very dark mark on our history. This was the era of McCarthyism is really bad. That's why if you ever hear that term, oh, it's being McCarthyism or this is a McCarthy attack or something like that, you ever hear that reference used as an adjective, it's talking about when you try to attack somebody using just rumor and you don't have any real evidence, that you're making up these charges and kind of trumping them up and you're destroying people based on rumor. All right. So now we're going to continue our discussion of the Cold War. Like I said, during the Cold War, the United States and the USSR will not go to war with each other. We may hate each other. We maybe can't stand each other, but we're not going to attack each other. Because if we have a war between the two of us, we're going to destroy the earth. I mean, it's going to go nuclear. It's going to be a mess. So what you end up having are basically two proxy wars. That's what the Cold War is known for. And what do I mean by proxy wars? A proxy war means, listen, the U.S. and the USSR can't stand each other, but we can't attack each other. So what ends up happening is a friend of the U.S. and a friend of the Soviet Union, they will attack each other. You get what I'm saying? And like, we'll help our friend and the Soviet Union will help our friend. So they kind of act as a proxy. Like, we can't attack each other, but our friends will attack each other. And I'll support this aspect. It's kind of like that. They're kind of like the fill-in. So one example of this is the Korean War. What happens is North Korea and South Korea have a fight. And instead of minding our business, the United States gets involved, because what happens is North Korea is a communist country, right? The North Korea, what ends up happening is there is, after the war, the country was split at the 38th parallel. The North is kind of communist. The South is democratic. Anyway, long story short, the North invades the South. And this one's a little different than Vietnam. What happens is once the North invades the South, the United Nations steps in and says, You're an aggressive nation. We're going to send in peacekeeping troops because, you should respect the border, blah, blah, blah. All right, we're going to stop this. What happens is that the UN forces basically are made up majority of U.S. troops. And the U.S. troops come in to support this UN effort. And so, at first, like the North was completely winning. It looked like it was like a done deal. But then once the U.S. troops, the UN troops get involved, we push the North Koreans all the way back. But we don't stop just at the capital. We push even further back, and we take the North Korea. We push them almost to the border of China. And naturally, China's seeing all this, and they're not happy with what's going on in their backyard. So China ends up getting involved in the war. And now the tables have turned. So China ends up helping the North Koreans kind of push back. Long story short, we sign a peace agreement. We have a ceasefire in 1953. And basically, nothing's accomplished except a lot of people died, because the war starts with the country split at the 38th parallel, and it finishes with the country split at the 38th parallel. And that's why today North Korea is still half communist, half democracy, right? So North Korea is under a totalitarian communist regime in North Korea. The South Korea, that's the home of K-pop and Kia cars, right? So South Korea is democratic. All right, another thing that comes out during this era in the 1950s during this Cold War era is, oddly enough, the Interstate Highways Act. You may not realize that the reason why you have interstate roads, and what do I mean by that? If you ever see the signs that have that red and blue, that means that these are the big roads that cross state lines. Like, so for us, the LIE. The LIE is an interstate highway. And you may know, if you've ever been on the LIE, it's a beautiful road, right? It's got 4 lanes, and it's beautiful road, very, very big and wide. Lots of traffic on it, but what are you going to do? It's very popular. And what happens is these roads are built in the 1950s. They are federal roads. They are built with federal money. Now, this is very different, right? Normally, highways are built, they're state roads. Okay, so like if you've ever taken the Meadowbrook Parkway or the Southern State Parkway, those are parkways. Those are run by the state. Okay, that they're run and maintained by New York State. They're state roads. But an interstate highway is different because it crosses state lines. And the argument was that the federal government needed to build these roads for the safety and security of the country. That was the argument. So we're building these highways because in the case of a nuclear war, we need to be able to get people out, and we need to get the army in very, very quickly. So we need to build these huge roads to be able to move people quickly. So that's why the federal government spent billions of dollars building them. And still to today, they are maintained with federal funds. So that's why generally they're in really good shape, much better than the state roads. And again, now today, it's not like only the army uses them, people use them. That's why I'm able to commute to work so quick, is that it allows people, it helps trade, it helps people commute, and it enables the growth of the suburbs, right? We talked about that in the 1920s, but again, the 1950s, even more so, okay? So between, like I said, the suburbs start, if you remember the GI Bill, sorry, we haven't gotten to that yet. But after World War II, remember the GI Bill, that's going to enable the growth of the suburbs, and that plus interstate highways, again, it just makes it even easier for people to start moving out of the cities and moving further away. All right, next part of the Cold War, we should also talk about the space race. Okay, this is something that kind of goes throughout this era. What happens is it starts with the Soviet Union in the 1950s. The Soviets are the first country to launch a satellite into orbit. And it's successful. It's known as Sputnik. The U.S. tries to do the same thing. It's embarrassing. Our satellite doesn't even make it off the launch pad. It explodes. They call it Flopnik. It was just an embarrassment. And then the Soviet Union goes further. Not only does it get a satellite up into the atmosphere, but then it actually gets a human being, the first cosmonaut, up into space. So they get the first man in space. And now this is a complete embarrassment for the U.S. because now it looks like we are complete slackers when it comes to science and technology, and that we've fallen behind the communists. So what happens is the U.S. puts a lot of money, focus, energy into building a space program. So they literally passed the National Defense Education Act. And John F. Kennedy, right, JFK Jr., becomes president. And one of the things he pledges is we are going to send a man to the moon. And we actually do that in 1969. So naturally, the Soviet Union is like, we won the space race because we were the first to space. United States says we won the space race because we're the first one with a man on the moon. So whatever, we both did very well for ourselves. Oh, by the way, if you may be wondering, how was the United States able to turn around its space program so quickly? I mean, you go from having a rocket that explodes, without even leaving the Earth, and now you turn around, you get people to the moon. How'd you do it? Yeah, Project Paperclip. We brought in Nazi scientists, basically after World War II. We give them, we basically say, hey, listen, we need to build up our space program. We will forgive you for all your Nazi activities, and we allow them to come to the United States. So a lot of our scientists who were part of the early NASA program were former Nazis. So some of them were not very nice people. But if you want to learn more about it, you can Google Project Paperclip and learn more. All right. Oh, yeah, that's never on the regions, by the way. Okay. So now next thing up that you should be aware of in this era is the start of televised presidential debates. You may remember we talked about in the 1950s that this is the first era that television is invented, and that's going to be have a huge impact on the culture. It also has a huge impact on politics because now it is, for the first time as a candidate, you have to sell yourself on TV. And the big example of this is the Nixon versus JFK debates. What happens is you have JFK, good-looking young guy, completely suave, like, hey, how you doing, girl? Well, he doesn't do it like that, but you get what I'm saying. He's like this suave, cool guy, and he's like debating, and he's up against this old man. Nixon is sweating. He's like, looks like he's a panicked idiot, and it looked just night and day on TV, right? Now, if it was over TV, if it was over radio, or if it was just like typed up on a newspaper, it may not have been as bad. I mean, you may have even made the argument that Nixon did a better job. But with television, Nixon just looked terrible. So a lot of people credit this televised debate with helping JFK win the election. And JFK, one of the things you should know about him is he is a supporter of civil rights. We're going to talk about some of the things he did we did talk about some of the things he did during that civil rights era in support of like the Freedom Riders and things like that. You should also know that he appoints the first black justice to the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. You should know that name. He is one of the lawyers for Brown v. Board of Education, and he is the first African American to serve on the nation's Supreme Court. All right, what else? Another big thing you have to know about JFK is his involvement with Cuba. In global history, you're going to learn about the Cuban Revolution. What happens is the U.S. supported the Batista government, which was basically dictatorship, very corrupt, not exactly the best government. But Batista hated communists. Well, lo and behold, Fidel Castro overthrows the Batista government. And naturally, during the Cold War, if you're a communist, automatically you're a bad guy as far as the U.S. is concerned. And this is now a communist country that is like right off our border. Cuba is located about 40 miles from Florida. That is very scary close, right? So what happens is the United States government organizes the Bay of Pigs invasion. What happens is we get 1,400 Cubans who had fled Cuba. The CIA trains them and then, drops them off in Cuba and says, like, go kill Castro. Forget about it. The guys don't even make it off the beach. They're captured. It's like completely embarrassing. That they're caught and what have you. So that plan completely fails. But naturally, the relationship between Cuba and the United States goes from bad to worse. But then you get the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, forget about it. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis is, we were this close. My fingers are like almost touching, as close as they can get without touching. That's how close we came to World War III with the Cuban Missile Crisis. What ends up happening is, like I said, Cuba becomes a communist country, right? So you have communist Soviet Union and communist China, and now communist Cuba. And what ends up happening is Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union in 1962, he approaches Castro and asks, hey, could I put some nuclear missiles in Cuba? Castro's like, sure, bring them in. So naturally, I mean, we have nuclear weapons. It's not like you drop them off and just store them on the driveway. You know what I'm saying? Like you got to build a place to store them. So you start building missile silos. Well, the U.S. spy planes flying over Cuba sees the missile silos being built, and we know what's up. So JFK basically tells Khrushchev, like, listen, I'm not playing. You put those nuclear weapons into Cuba, we'll go to war. Like we're not playing. It's not happening. And he sends ships to blockade Cuba. So what does that mean? Literally, there are ships like surrounding the island of Cuba. Nobody comes in, nobody comes out. He's like, you're not delivering nuclear weapons to Cuba. I'm not playing. And like literally like people are gearing it up. They're like, all right, let's talk about how we're going to drop troops onto Cuban shores, and like we're ready. He was ready to go to World War III. What ends up happening is, thankfully, it doesn't get to that. Khrushchev's like, all right, I'll pull the weapons out, and he does. He changes plans. The missiles are not dropped off to Cuba, and luckily that starts to kind of decrease tensions because nobody wants to come that close to World War III. All right. Another thing just to be aware of, 1960s, 2 influential books are published in this era. One is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. She is the first person to kind of raise alarms about the use of pesticides and the impact they would have on the environment and on health. And she helped start the environmental movement. So the fact that the government has an EPA and things like that, it's credited to Rachel Carson's book. The other book that's very important in the 1960s is Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader. He is the first person to raise alarms about car safety. Of course, today, if you drive in a car, cars are designed that if you get into an accident, you should be able to walk away. Like the car will do everything it can to protect you, whether that's by, for example, if you get into a head-on collision, the front of the car is meant to collapse, you know what I mean? So that the part where the people are will stay. Okay. Back in the 1950s, there was a car that was designed so like if you hit the gas tank, the whole car exploded. Like you hit one part of the car, people were getting their heads chopped off because the steering wheel would fly off. I mean, like the cars just crumpled up like nothing, and people died in car accidents all the time. And it was really the start of Ralph Nader's book in 1965 that kind of gets automakers to start thinking about designing their cars in a way to keep the driver safe, and the public demands safer cars. You start getting more safety equipment, you start getting seat belts, you start, and like I said, even today we have airbags, and the federal government gets the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration gets formed. So if you remember in the 1920s, but in the progressive era, in that early 1900s, we talked about the muckrakers, how important their work was, things like The Jungle and, the work of Jacob Riis and things like that, like making people aware of, different things going on and inspiring people to kind of fix them. That we saw that with the muckrakers. We saw that even with Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, during the Civil War era. This kind of role that these writers can play. These books, Silent Spring, Unsafe at Any Speed, would kind of be other examples of that. All right, so 1963, we talked about JFK real quick, but unfortunately he doesn't live that long. He dies pretty quick. He's actually shot. Famously, his wife was right next to him, and the poor woman has to go from like literally sitting next to her husband as he's shot, and in her blood-stained suit, stands up with the vice president he's sworn into office. But as I said, JFK will be assassinated, and he will be succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson does try to continue JFK's work as far as, like I said, JFK was a supporter of civil rights, so will Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson also supports something known as the Great Society, where he wants to have a war on poverty. And so he starts really important programs like Medicaid and Medicare, right? He starts programs like Job Corps and Project Head Start. He, signs the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation, if you remember from that earlier presentation. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of his Great Society, which again, very similar to Roosevelt's New Deal, that the government is going to step in and kind of solve these social problems. The problem with Lyndon B. Johnson is that at the same time he wants to promote his Great Society, he's also fighting the Vietnam War. So what happens is these kinds of health, education, and welfare programs cost a lot of money. And instead of kind of focusing his budget and focusing his effort on, making these improvements on a domestic scale, instead he's forced to spend a lot of money on military and on arms because, again, he's fighting the Vietnam War. So let's talk about the Vietnam War. Vietnam War is, again, another one of these proxy wars. It's another one that occurs during the Cold War. Some of you may look at this, may look familiar, right? It's the idea of dominoes, right? And what happens when you push down one domino? Click, 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 click. It takes all the other dominoes with you. Well, this is basically the theory that pulls the United States into the Vietnam War. It's the idea of the domino theory, that if Vietnam falls to communism, all the other countries of Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, that they'll all start falling to communism. So you have to prop up Vietnam. You have to prevent Vietnam from falling to communism to protect the rest of the region. And that's why the U.S. gets involved with Vietnam, because Vietnam starts as an issue where Vietnam was a French colony. Okay. And it basically, as far as the Vietnamese were concerned, this was just a war for independence, that they didn't want to be a French colony anymore. They wanted independence. But the issue is that the independence leader in the north of Vietnam was a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh, and Ho Chi Minh is a communist. So in the context of the Cold War, once you know he's a communist, he's an enemy, period, end of discussion. It didn't matter what he believed in or, whatever. He's a communist, he's an enemy to the U.S. So unlike the Korean War, which is kind of fought under the under the UN, here it's a little different. Now we're fighting we start off kind of slow. We give a lot of money and we give advisors. We help the French because the French at first are fighting the Vietnamese. But then the French pull out and we're just kind of helping the South Vietnam, because North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam wasn't. And we give a lot of money, we give advisors. But by 1964, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the U.S. steps up its involvement. It starts a bombing campaign, and then the following year, we actually start sending in U.S. troops. It's a brutal war that we lose. We are going to lose the Vietnam War. It lasts for a really, really long time. A lot of people die, and a lot of people say, it was just like a pointless war. I mean, it was something we were fighting for bad reasons, and it didn't really matter, and a lot of people died. It took a real toll on society, on the U.S. society. All right. So first thing you need to know, one of the most important things you have to know about the Vietnam War is this Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The argument is the U.S. has to get involved in Vietnam. Like I said, we were involved in Vietnam, but we were involved in like a more kind of behind the scenes money advisor type role. But what happens is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution ends up that they accuse, according to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the North Koreans attacked U.S. ships. And this is what escalates the war. This is what leads to the Congress to approve the sending of troops to Vietnam. Okay? What ends up happening is that evidence comes out later that this was a lie. That really the North Vietnamese had never attacked U.S. ships, that this never happened. So we kind of got pulled into the war under false circumstances. In addition, you should know that unlike World War II, if you remember in World War II, FDR came in front of the Senate and said, this is a day that will let it live in infamy. And the Senate, voted to go to war. That does not happen in Vietnam. This is an executive action. The president says this is an emergency situation. It's a police, I need to send our troops there. And he never asks for an authorization to go to war from the Congress or from Senate. And this is something that is followed up. Like this is now, since World War II, we have never officially declared war on anyone. We've had many wars. We've had Iraq War and Afghanistan War. We've done bombings in Kosovo. We've done, we've had tons of we've had the Gulf War. We've had all kinds of wars, but yet never have they been officially declared wars. That the last one we did was World War II. We haven't had one since. All right. This war was brutal in a lot of ways. This is the Lai Massacre. What happens is you have a lot of U.S. troops. They're very, very young. And there were some war crimes committed on our end. This is one where American soldiers killed men, women, children in this village. They were just slaughtering them. The massacres were covered up, and the prosecutions were pretty weak. It really sad. Again, real embarrassing. And a lot of Americans were anti-war, and when that Lai Massacre comes out, people are even more kind of anti-war. In this context of the Vietnam War, let me tell you what's going on politically. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in 1968. He was a big critic of the Vietnam War. He thought, the people who were going were mostly poor kids and a lot of people of color. He was very uncomfortable. He was like, yeah, okay, we've made some political changes, but there's still the problem of income inequality. And at the time he was assassinated, he was not the popular figure he is today. A lot of white people turned against him, but people never talk about that. And there were a lot of riots after King's death. That same year, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. Looked like JFK's brother was gonna make it to president, but he ended up getting killed. And Richard Nixon ends up running for president and winning, and he does it with the strategy of saying, I'm going to bring back law and order, that this society has gotten a little too out of hand, and don't worry, I'm going to end the Vietnam War. And that's not what happens. All right. Because again, you guys may be familiar, the Vietnam War is not popular at home, not popular. A lot of young people are being, pulled in, they're being drafted to go to Vietnam, and people listen, when it was World War II and the Japanese bombed America, we're in, you know what I mean? But this one, it was like, what the hell do we care what government Vietnam has? I mean, a lot of people weren't sold on it, and a lot of people were dying. It was a very, very brutal war. And you see a lot of young people are very anti-war, but a lot, especially that older generation, is like, hey, be a good American and be loyal and, go fight. So there's this, people who want the kind of law and order and people who are anti-war. And there's lots and lots of, lots of conflict within society if you're pro or anti-war. And it kind of starts ripping the country apart. Now, President Nixon, meanwhile, ran saying, I'm going to end this war. I'm going to end this war. And what happens? He gets the job as president, and he actually expands the war. He makes it even bigger because he doesn't want to lose. He doesn't want to be we've never lost a war, and he doesn't want to be the first one to lose. So it actually gets worse. He had this plan. He was like, don't worry about it. We're going to pull out of the war. I'm going to shift responsibility away from the U.S. I'm going to leave it to the South Vietnamese to fight. And of course, it doesn't work. All right. Here's one of the other issues that comes out during the Vietnam War, and I'm going to explain this to you. All right, as you can see, this is the country of Vietnam, okay? And it's a war between the North Vietnamese versus the South Vietnamese. We support the South Vietnamese. So naturally, the North Vietnamese have to get supplies to their guerrilla soldiers in the South Vietnamese. What happens is they were Viet Cong. Those were the guerrilla soldiers operating in South Vietnam. And they were in South Vietnam, but they supported the North. They were communist troops. So they need supplies. Now, if you run supplies this way, you're an idiot because the U.S. troops are going to stop them. You can't go through Vietnam. We're going to find your supplies, and we're going to stop you from resupplying your troops. So what do? Instead of going through Vietnam, you go outside. You cross the border into Laos and into Cambodia. You run your supplies, and then you come back into South Vietnam, and that's how you bring your supplies in, right? You run them through these other countries. Well, what ends up happening is Nixon authorizes the bombing of Laos and Cambodia. You're not allowed to do that. That's illegal. We did not declare war on Laos and Cambodia. They were just innocent. They didn't know people crossing their border. It's not like they have border security there or, top-notch security working there. These guys are just crossing the border and running through. But anyway, these countries are bombed. It widens the scope of our involvement. And this, when people find out about it, they get really, really angry that because you're killing so many people. This carpet bombings were brutal, killing men, women, and children. And you end up, there becomes more protests, even a protest at Kent State, which we're going to talk about in a second. And, meanwhile, again, Nixon appeals to this kind of law and order crowd of, hey, silent majority, help me win this war and stand up to these protesters. Anyway, this is Kent State. Kent State is famous because there was a bunch of college students who were anti-war and they were demonstrating. And lo and behold, 4 of these demonstrators are killed and 9 were injured when the National Guard opened fire on them. So they were nonviolent, innocent college kids, you know what I mean? And they were just protesting the Vietnam War. And now they're getting murdered by the National Guard, by their own people. So again, this makes those kind of anti-war protesters just so much more angry and causes even more cultural conflict. All right, in the context of this, we get the case of New York Times versus United States. Really important, very important case in the Supreme Court. What happens is the reason we find out about that illegal bombing of Cambodia and Laos, the reason we find out that the United States had been involved in Vietnam way before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the reason we find out about that is because Daniel Ellsberg releases the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post. So these were classified documents that he illegally leaked. These were classified documents, and he gave those documents to the newspapers. And Nixon did not want them released. He said, you can't release these. These were illegally obtained. We should be able to stop them. And the Supreme Court said no. They said that the First Amendment allows a newspaper to print this information, that even if they're classified, even if they're illegally leaked, unless it would cause a grave and irreparable danger. Like, for example, if your classified document says, okay, this army is going to be at this location, and now that knowledge is going to allow the enemy to go kill the troops, that might be a different story. But something like this, where it's just politically embarrassing and is going to make the country angry, yeah, no, you can't. They have every right to publish it. So that was really important. And I totally recommend, if you have a second, I show this. If I had more time, I would do it. Great YouTube video. What were the Pentagon Papers? And it was a video put together by the History Channel. If you have a chance to watch it on YouTube, I recommend it. All right, so the end of the Vietnam War, 1973, we finally admit to the reality. We're not going to win this war. And we withdraw forces, and Saigon falls to the communists. After the Vietnam War, you do get something known as the War Powers Act, which is supposed to limit the president's ability to start wars. It doesn't work out that great, because we've had plenty of wars since then that did not get congressional approval first, so it's still pretty weak. But we did attempt, the War Powers Act is supposed to limit the president's ability to go to war without some kind of congressional approval and oversight. Today, we very often compare the Vietnam War to what happened with the war in Afghanistan, because, this is one of the dangerous things, that starting a war is easy. Ending a war is hard. And we see the Vietnam War used to be the longest war in America's history. Afghanistan has now gone longer. I think it's something like we're up to 11 years or even more that we've been in this war. Another thing to know about the 1970s is the formation of OPEC and the effect it has on us. That OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It leads to the rise of oil prices. Oil embargoes are placed on the U.S., so that's why in the 1970s you have this big line for cars, and OPEC becomes a very powerful organization. It's mostly made up of Middle Eastern countries, includes a couple of other countries in addition, but they control the price and supply of oil. Nixon, you should also know, in addition to his involvement with Vietnam, he's also known for a foreign policy of détente. He tries to ease Cold War tensions. Very famous meeting with the leader of the Soviet Union, actually visiting communist China. So he does try to kind of cool down those tensions between us. But what he's most known for, or infamous for, I should say, is Nixon's involvement in Watergate. What Watergate is that basically burglars were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee. They were trying to wiretap phones and steal documents. They were trying to cover up the involvement of Nixon and members of Nixon's administration. Basically a crime of basically financing and things like that. And they were caught trying to cover it up. And these two reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, are able to connect these burglars who broke into the DNC with Nixon and the Nixon administration. And what happens is Nixon's whole thing is, listen, I can't be a crook. I'm the president. I get executive privilege. You can't you can't hold me accountable. I'm the president. I'm above the law. And the Supreme Court says no. In U.S. versus Nixon, they say no person, not even the president, is above the law. They say the president does not have privilege, that the Supreme Court does have jurisdiction over the president, and they force Nixon to hand over tapes. There were a lot of tapes that he had that proved his involvement and proved that he was around and involved with this break-in and, the cover-up for his criminal activities. And what ends up happening is Nixon is impeached by the House. So that means that the House says, all right, there's enough evidence to start a prosecution. But once he's impeached, Nixon resigns. He says, I quit, and he walks away. He quits because the next step would have been to go to the Senate, and he would have been put on trial. And he would have lost, just, straight up. The Senate was against him. It was filled with members of the other party. There was a ton of evidence. There was no way he was going to win. So he quits office before he can be convicted. So he is one of a handful of presidents who have been impeached. But he was not convicted. But the only reason he wasn't convicted is because he quit first. His vice president ends up becoming president, and the first thing Ford does is pardons Nixon. So he gives him a full presidential pardon for any crimes he may have committed. So Nixon is never held accountable, which, of course, that's the reason why Ford is only going to serve one term. People are not happy about that. And this whole Watergate scandal creates a lot of mistrust for people of the government. They don't trust the government anymore. And that starts with Watergate, and people still are pretty distrustful of the government. And you still hear that now, right? Where Trump talks about the deep state, and people really, don't trust the intentions of the government. And with that, we are done. Sorry, I know this one went long, but thank you so much for paying attention.